Hello, and welcome to another episode of Lore and Crime. This episode is part 2 of the Shark Arm murder. If you haven't heard the first part, I recommend starting there. One more thing before we jump in. This episode contains themes of violence and suicide. Listener discretion is advised. Detective Frank Mathews stood at the threshold of the cabin. In one fluid motion, Frank drew his service revolver, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and stepped into the dim interior.
"Please, don't move!"
he barked. Weapon trained on the figure hunched over an open chest in the corner. The man froze, his back to Frank, hands hovering mid-air above scattered papers.
"Turn around slowly, hands where I can see them."
The man complied, pivoting with deliberate care. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and wide-rimmed spectacles that caught what little light filtered through the cottage windows. His face was pale with shock, eyes wide behind the lenses.
"Detective Frank Mathews, Sydney CIB."
Frank said, keeping his revolver trained on the man.
"Identify yourself."
"Percival Forbes,"
the man stammered, raising his trembling hands higher.
"This is my cottage. I own Courtjoy."
Frank studied the man's face. Forbes didn't match the description of Patty Williams. He was older, more distinguished, lacking the small frame Albert and Gordon had described.
"Your identification,"
Frank demanded, gesturing with his free hand. Forbes slowly reached into his breast pocket, movements exaggerated to avoid any misunderstanding. He produced a leather wallet and opened it, revealing a driver's license. Frank glanced at it, confirming the name, then gestured with the gun for Forbes to put it away.
"What is this about?"
Forbes asked, his voice steadier now.
"I've done nothing wrong."
"Just routine inquiries."
Frank said, holstering his weapon but keeping his stance ready.
"This cottage, you ran it out?"
Forbes nodded, adjusting his spectacles with his trembling fingers.
"Yes, I do. It's a holiday let. I only come down to check on it between tenants."
Frank gestured to the scattered papers.
"And that's what we're doing now? Checking up?"
"Well, yes and no."
Forbes hesitated, then sighed heavily.
"The last tenant left rather abruptly. He cleared out nearly 2 weeks ago. I'm just making sure everything is in order."
Frank's interest sharpened.
"This tenant, what was his name?"
Frank asked, stepping closer to examine the papers strewn across the floor. Forbes blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question.
"Brady. Pat Brady. Wiry little fellow. Had this way of talking, fast and nervous, with a bit of an Irish inflection to it."
Frank's pulse quickened. The name sparked immediate recognition. Memories of case files and mugshots surfacing in his mind. Pat Brady, not Patty Williams. The name was different, but the description matched what Albert and Gordon had said about Williams, and the Irish accent explained the nickname Patty. He was on the right track.
"And when exactly did he leave?"
"April 15th. Left without notice, just dropped the keys in my mailbox with a note saying he wouldn't be needing the place anymore."
"Did you notice anything unusual about the cabin when you came to check on it after Brady left?"
Forbes looked around as he adjusted his spectacles nervously.
"Well, yes, several things struck me as odd. For one, Brady originally wanted the cottage for 6 or 8 weeks, but only stayed for 4. And when I came to inspect, the place was scrupulously clean. Almost too clean, if you take my meaning."
Frank nodded, scanning the room with new interest.
"Go on."
"The boat shed's been thoroughly cleaned as well. A tin trunk and one of the mattresses were replaced with newer ones. Several items are gone. A rug, a coil of rope, and all my window weights. Why would someone steal window weights of all things?"
Frank's jaw tightened.
"Show me the boat shed."
Forbes led him through the back door and down a sandy path to a weathered wooden structure perched at the water's edge. Inside, a small rowboat bobbed gently against the wooden dock. Frank quickly spotted that the boat had been roughly handled. One of the rowlocks was splintered, and a paddle was conspicuously absent.
"I normally keep it in ship shape,"
Forbes explained, following the detective's gaze.
"I found it like this."
Frank's mind raced, piecing together the evidence. Window weights for ballast, missing rope, a thoroughly cleaned cottage, and a damaged rowboat. all the makings of a disposal job.
Is there anything else unusual you noticed, Mr. Forbes? Anything at all?
Frank asked, his voice tight with urgency. Forbes shook his head.
No, Detective. I think that covers it.
Frank nodded grimly.
I need you to stay right here while I find a telephone. Don't touch anything else. This is now potentially a police crime scene, and I'll be sending a crew down to process it properly.
A crime scene?
Forbes paled visibly.
Good heavens, what could—
I can't discuss details of an ongoing investigation.
Frank cut him off, already moving towards the door.
Just sit tight.
Frank strode back towards the Hotel Cecil, his mind racing faster than his feet could carry him. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. He had seen enough disposal jobs in his career to recognize the signs. Pat Brady hadn't just been Smith's drinking companion, he was almost certainly his killer. The Cecil bar was getting busier now, afternoon drinkers filling the tables. Frank pushed past them to the telephone booth in the corner, ignoring the curious stares. He dropped his coins into the slot and gave the operator the number.
Sydney CIB, Detective Calvin speaking,
came the crisp response after several rings.
Cal, it's Frank. I need you to put out an all-points bulletin on Patrick Brady, alias Patty Williams. He's now our primary suspect.
While the press was still being told that no foul play was being suspected regarding the disgorged arm, the police knew better, and were now actively searching for Pat Brady. As for the whereabouts of Jim Smith's known associates, of which 3 were of particular interest, Reginald Holmes had left suddenly on a trip to Melbourne the day after the shark disgorged the arm. Albert Stannard and Gregory Vaughan both said they were at home at the time of Jim Smith's disappearance. The alibis were corroborated only by their respective wives. Although the detectives harbored suspicions, they had discovered little evidence to link them to Jim Smith's death. It was late afternoon on May 16th, with a heavy mist clinging to Sydney Harbor, obscuring the bridge and casting the city into a ghostly pall. Detective Frank Mathews sat slumped in the passenger seat of an unmarked police car, nursing a lukewarm coffee as he watched the modest 2-story house across the street. The vehicle was parked in the shadow of an overgrown tree on a quiet North Sydney street, giving them a clear view while remaining inconspicuous. Calman sat behind the wheel, eyes sharp, despite having been on the stakeout since 6 a.m. Neither man had spoken much in the last hour, the tension between them like a coiled spring.
"You're sure your informant is reliable?"
Calman finally asked, breaking the silence. Frank took a sip of his coffee, grimacing at the taste.
Reliable enough.
The tip had come from one of Frank's informants. Patrick Brady was holed up here, renting a spare room from a thug who worked at the docks.
"This is the longest stakeout of my career,"
Calman muttered, lowering his binoculars and rubbing his bloodshot eyes.
3 days of staring at that door and no Brady.
Frank started playing with a cigarette box, wondering if he should have another one.
Patience, Cal. Brady is in there. My gut tells me he'll make a move soon.
As if on cue, the front door of the house creaked open. Frank's hand shot out, gripping Calman's forearm.
There he is,
he hissed, adrenaline surging through his veins. A wiry man with hunched shoulders stepped cautiously onto the porch, glancing furtively up and down the street. Even from this distance, Frank recognized the nervous mannerisms that matched the description of Pat Brady perfectly. He wore a shabby brown suit and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes.
That's our man,
Frank confirmed, setting down his coffee.
Let him clear the house before we move.
Brady descended the steps and began walking briskly down the sidewalk, his gait stiff and hurried. Frank and Calman exchanged a quick glance before Calman started the car, keeping the headlights off as they rounded the corner. They spotted Brady 20 yards ahead, walking rapidly towards the harbor.
"He's heading for the ferry terminal,"
Calman muttered, easing the car forward. Frank nodded grimly.
Cut him off at Palmer Street. We'll approach on foot.
Calman swung the car around a side street, accelerating just enough to get ahead of the quarry without drawing attention. They parked hastily at the corner of Palmer and Blues Point Road, positioning themselves to intercept Brady. Frank checked his service revolver, then tucked it back into his holster.
Remember, he's potentially dangerous. Don't take any chances.
They split up at the corner, Calvin crossing to the opposite side of the street. Both men kept Brady in their sights as he approached, oblivious to the trap closing in around him. Brady was less than 10 yards away when something, maybe coincidence or just bad luck, made Brady reach for something inside his jacket. Frank reacted instantly.
Police, freeze!
Frank said, drawing his weapon as Brady's head snapped up, eyes wild with panic. For a split second, Brady stood frozen, then spun on his heels and bolted in the opposite direction, darting between two buildings into a narrow alleyway.
Damn it!
Frank cursed, holstering his gun as he sprinted after the subject. Brady was surprisingly fast for his wiry frame, weaving through the alley with the desperation of a cornered animal. Frank pounded after him, his lungs burning as he shouldered past startled pedestrians, keeping the suspect's brown cap in sight. Brady glanced back, his face contorted with fear when he saw Frank gaining in on him. He veered suddenly, leaping over a low fence into a narrow footpath that snaked between rows of weathered houses. Frank cursed under his breath. The path was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, with high wooden fences on either side.
He's taking the shortcut to Lavender Bay.
Frank shouted to Kalman before jumping over the fence.
Circle around.
Frank plunged into the narrow passage, the walls closing in around him. Ahead, Brady's footsteps echoed in the packed dirt, punctuated by his ragged breathing. The path twisted sharply left, then right, following the contours of the hillside as it descended towards the harbor. The air grew thick with the smell of salt and rotting seaweed as they neared the water. Frank's shoes slipped on the damp earth, nearly sending him sprawling. He recovered his balance without breaking stride, his lungs burning with each desperate gulp of air. The path suddenly opened into a small clearing that overlooked the harbor. The only other way out was now manned by Detective Kalman, who had successfully circled around. Brady skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing, where a 20-foot drop separated him from the rocky shoreline below.
Nowhere to run, Brady.
Frank called out, slowing his approach as he caught his breath.
It's over.
Brady turned, his face twisted in a grimace of panic and rage.
Stay back,
he said. He edged closer to the drop, loose stones skittering down the embankment.
Don't be stupid,
Frank said, hands raised as he inched forward.
That's a nasty fall. You won't make it.
Brady's eyes darted wildly between Frank and the drop behind him.
What do you want from me?
He spat.
We just want to talk, Brady.
Frank said, his voice softening as he took another careful step forward.
About a bank check.
Brady's face contorted, doubt in his eyes.
I don't know nothing about any check,
he stammered, but his voice trembled with the lie.
Come on, Patty.
Kalman chimed in, his tone almost conversational.
We're not here to rough you up. Just a few questions and then you'll be on your way.
Brady's eyes darted between the two detectives, calculating his odds. Frank could see the man's resolve wavering, the tense shoulders beginning to slump.
No tricks?
Brady asked, taking a tentative step away from the edge.
No tricks,
Frank muttered, lowering his hands.
Just a chat.
Brady finally surrendered with a resigned nod, shoulders slumping as he stepped away from the edge. Frank moved cautiously, producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat's pocket.
Turn around,
he instructed, and Brady complied without protest, his early defiance evaporating like morning mist.
This is just procedure,
Frank explained as he secured the cuffs.
We'll take these off at the station.
The ride to Sydney Police Headquarters was silent. Brady slumped in the back seat, staring blankly at the passing streets. Frank caught Kalman's eyes as he drove, a shared look of satisfaction passing between them. They'd been hunting Brady for weeks, and now they finally had him. The interrogation room at headquarters was deliberately austere. Cracked linoleum floors, a table bolted to the floor, and 3 uncomfortable chairs. Frank abandoned Brady on a hard wooden stool. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours. 2, then 3, then 4, as Brady shifted uncomfortably, his initial bravado crumbling under the weight of isolation and uncertainty. Frank watched through the one-way mirror, smoking his 3rd cigarette, studying Brady's every twitch and nervous glance. The man's facade was cracking. Frank could see it in the way he drummed his fingers on the table, how he kept checking the door.
Mrs. Brady's here.
Kalman announced, stepping into the observation room with a file tucked under his arm.
Constable Limsey found her at her brother's place in Newton. Wasn't easy. She's been bouncing between relatives since Brady went underground.
Good work.
Frank muttered, crushing his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. Frank nodded to Kalman.
Let's go.
The door to the interrogation room swung open with a metallic groan as Frank strode in, case file tucked under his arm. Brady's head snapped, eyes darting between the two detectives as they settled into chairs across from him.
Patrick Brady.
Frank began, his voice deceptively casual as he flipped open the file.
Quite the resume you've got here. Juvenile detention at 12, forgery in the army, 3 separate convictions of check fraud.
He looked up, meeting Brady's nervous gaze.
Seems you've been busy since your release in 33.
Brady looked over at the detectives.
Am I being charged with something?
Frank pulled a piece of paper from his file.
You're being accused of forging a check in connection to the arrest of Eddie Wayman in May of 1934.
Brady's shoulders relaxed slightly.
That all you got? Old news, detective. I had nothing to do with that.
Frank exchanged a look with Kalman before continuing.
Actually, Mr. Brady,
Frank leaned forward, voice dropping to a confidential tone.
the fraud charges are not the only reason we brought you in. What we really want to discuss is Jim Smith.
Brady's face blanched, his fingers freezing mid-fidget on the tabletop.
Smith? Don't know any Smith.
That's funny,
Frank said, slapping a photograph onto the table.
because we have witnesses who say you and Jim were very chummy-like.
He leaned in, his voice hardening.
The same Jim Smith whose severed arm washed up in a shark's stomach 3 weeks ago.
Brady's facade cracked completely, his face draining of color as he stared at the photograph of Smith's tattooed arm laid out on an examination table.
This isn't about fraud, Brady.
Kalman interjected, his tone deadly serious.
You're sitting in a murder investigation room, and right now, you're our prime suspect.
I never...
Brady stammered, pushing back from the table. Frank slammed his palm down hard, making Brady jump.
Listen carefully, because I'm only going to ask this once more. And don't forget that what you say here can be considered as evidence. Do you know Jim Smith?
Brady's eyes darted between the detectives, finally settling in on the picture of Jim Smith. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard.
Look, I know Jim all right, but I ain't seen him since I got back from Tassie a few months ago.
Frank leaned back, a skeptical smirk playing at his lips.
Tasmania, huh? When exactly did you get back from this little holiday?
End of February.
Brady mumbled, shifting uncomfortably in his stool.
And where have you been staying since your return?
Kalman asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp, watching Brady's every micro-expression.
No fixed address in our records.
Brady's gaze dropped to his hands.
Here and there, friends' places. Why does it matter where I've been sleeping?
Brady's voice rose defensively.
That's my business.
Frank exchanged a meaningful glance with Kalman before leaning across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper.
Everything about you is our business now. Maybe we should ask your wife. She's been here for a couple of hours now. Maybe she can fill in the blanks.
Brady's face contorted into panic.
My wife's here? You can't. She don't know nothing about any of this.
He lurched forward in his chair, the handcuffs clanking against the table.
About what, Brady?
Frank pounced, sensing weakness.
What doesn't she know about?
Nothing. I mean,
Brady's eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the room's chill. Frank stood abruptly, scraping his chair against the floor.
I think Mrs. Brady might be very interested to hear about your cottage in Cronulla. Court Joy, was it?
Brady's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water.
I got rights.
Brady said, suddenly defiant.
I want a lawyer. You can't keep me in here.
Frank leaned in, his weathered face inches from Brady's.
Oh, we can keep you here, Brady, as long as we need to. Murder investigations have certain privileges.
Brady's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him.
I didn't kill nobody.
He muttered, but the conviction had left his voice. Frank slid back into his chair with a deliberate slowness. his eyes never leaving Brady's face as he pulled a manila folder from his jacket. He placed it on the table with a soft tap and flipped it open, revealing several witness statements.
That's what I thought you'd say.
Frank said, his voice deceptively calm.
But here's the problem, Patty. We've got several separate witnesses who place you at the Hotel Cecil in Cronulla on April 8th, playing dominoes and drinking with Jim Smith.
He pushed a statement across the table.
Albert Ward and Gordon Dahl both gave statements saying you and Smith were thick as thieves before he went missing. Then, there's all this stuff in the cabin missing or replaced. Care to explain that?
Brady's face drained of color as he stared at the paper, but he just sat there. Frank gathered all the files on the table, then nodded to Kalman.
Look, what did you think about your options? Your wife's statement should be ready soon.
He moved towards the door, then paused.
I'll give you one more chance to come clean before we check in with her. Tell us your side of the story.
Brady stared at the door, then at his cuffed hands, the weight of his predicament settling in on his shoulders like a leaden shroud. Sweat trickled down his temples as he contemplated his wife being questioned, imagining her fear, her confusion, the thought of her learning new things or saying too much.
Wait.
He called out, his voice cracking.
Just wait a bloody minute.
Frank paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, not turning around.
Yes, Brady.
I'll talk,
Brady said, slumping in his stool.
Just leave my wife out of this. She don't know nothing.
Frank exchanged a quick glance with Kalman before returning to the table. He pulled out his notebook and nodded for Brady to continue. Brady licked his lips.
Once I got back from Tassie, I received a message from Smith. I went to see him at his home. In the course of our chat, a discussion came up about a check he wanted to use. He said he would arrange with Mr. Holmes to get the material.
Frank raised a hand to halt him.
Holmes? Reginald Holmes, the boat builder?
Brady nodded.
Look, I'm not saying I did anything wrong, but I might know something about this mess. I have known Holmes for about 12 months. I was introduced to him by James Smith, who, at the time, was looking after a boat called the Pathfinder.
Frank and Kalman exchanged glances. This was the connection they had been hunting for.
Go on.
Frank urged, his pen poised over his notebook. Brady's eyes darted nervously around the room before he continued.
Holmes needed Jim to do something for him, to return some materials he had taken from the Pathfinder. I was helping, as a friend you see, so I lent them my cabin.
The cottage at Cronulla?
Frank pressed, leaning forward.
Court Joy, right?
Brady nodded, his fingers fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve.
Smith was in some kind of trouble. Needed to give back some stuff he took from the boat before it sank.
What kind of stuff?
Kalman asked, scribbling furiously on his notebook.
A radio, silverware I think, maybe something else.
Brady shrugged, avoiding eye contact.
I didn't ask too many questions. In my line of work, you learn not to.
Frank's jaw tightened.
So you were saying Holmes was there?
Brady's expression shifted, a flicker of panic crossing his features. He hesitated, mouth opening and closing as if caught in a lie.
No, I don't know.
Brady faltered, his previous confidence evaporating. His eyes darted towards the door, then back to Frank's penetrating gaze.
I mean, I never saw Holmes there myself. Smith just said he was involved.
Frank leaned back, studying Brady's face. The man was lying, or at least not telling the whole truth.
You're backpedaling, Brady,
Frank said, his voice low and dangerous.
First you said you were lending Holmes and Smith the cabin. Now you're saying you never saw Holmes? Which is it? Walk us through it from when you and Jim were having drinks at the Hotel Cecil.
Brady's hands trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from his brow.
No, you got things all wrong.
Brady took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping.
Look, that Monday we had drinks, played some games at the bar, then went to the cabin to get a couple of drinks. But Jim left later that evening. He said he was going into town.
Frank and Kalman exchanged sharp glances. This was the first they'd heard of Smith leaving Cronulla that night.
Into town?
Frank pressed.
What time was this?
Around 8, I reckon.
Brady said, rubbing his cuffed wrists.
Said he had some business to take care of. I didn't think much of it because we agreed to meet the next day.
Frank's eyes narrowed.
So you're saying you met Smith again the next day, on the 9th?
Brady shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face.
Yeah, we did.
You sure about that?
Kalman interjected, his voice deceptively casual.
Because earlier you said you hadn't seen Smith since February.
Brady's face flushed.
I misspoke. Been under a lot of pressure lately.
Clearly. So, what happened on the 9th? Walk us through it.
Brady licked his lips nervously.
I went to see Holmes early that morning, around 7. Had to talk to him about some checks he wanted me to look at.
What checks?
Just regular business. Holmes wanted to ask me about a check he got from a guy named Carroll. He wanted to make sure it was legitimate.
Okay. So then, after that, you met with Jim?
Asked Kalman.
Yeah, we met at Carlton. Had a couple of drinks, and he told me he was gonna meet with some folk in Cronulla. I told him I had business in the city, and that he could have the cottage for the night, if he wanted it. That's the last I saw him.
Who was he meeting with?
I don't know. Didn't ask.
Where did you spend the night?
Asked Kalman, the two partners now teaming up to get straight answers from Brady.
I went to meet with Holmes. Stayed there till around 11 to go over that check business. He also gave me some money to get some stuff that he would need replacing in the cabin. He said Jim would need the trunk for the stuff he was going to get for him. It being late and all, I stayed the night in Kensington.
So what happened next?
Asked Frank, now understanding where this was going.
I went back to the cabin the next morning, but stopped beforehand to get the trunk Holmes asked me to get, and some other things I wanted to replace in the cabin, just upkeep. But when I got there, Smith was gone. I assumed his business was done since the tin can was gone and there were a few glasses lying around. I cleaned up a bit since the place hadn't been broomed in a few days, and that's that. Haven't seen or heard from Jim since.
So you just assumed everything was well?
Asked Frank with sarcasm.
Look, I'm not stupid. I read the papers. I won't say more. I'm not carrying the baby. I know you guys are trying to frame me, but last I saw Smith, he was alive. I don't know anything more than what I've told you. I want to speak to a lawyer now.
Frank glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 1 a.m. The interrogation had dragged on for hours, with Brady alternating between cooperation and evasion. The detective's eyes burned from fatigue, and Kalman looked no better, his usually immaculate appearance now rumpled and weary.
It's getting late.
Frank said, gathering the scattered papers onto his file.
We've been at it long enough.
Brady's shoulders sagged with visible relief.
About bloody time,
he muttered. Frank pushed a handwritten statement across the table.
Before we finish for the night, I need you to sign this. A record of everything you've told us so far.
Brady squinted at the document, then shook his head.
I can't read straight. It's too late. I'm exhausted. I'll read it properly and sign it in the morning.
Frank exchanged a glance with Kalman before pocketing the statement.
Fair enough. Looks like you could use the rest.
So I can go?
Brady asked, a flicker of hope crossing his exhausted features. Frank chuckled, the sound devoid of humor.
Oh, you're not going anywhere, Brady. We're charging you with fraud for now. Those bad checks you've been passing around. You'll spend the night here.
Brady's face fell.
A cell? But I've cooperated. I told you everything.
And we appreciate that.
Kalman said, his voice deceptively gentle as he helped Brady to his feet.
Consider it protective custody. After all, if Smith was murdered, his killer might not appreciate you talking to us.
Brady paled at the implication, offering no further resistance as Kalman guided him towards the door. The following day, Detective Mathews sat at his desk, the morning light filtering through the windows. Detective Kalman joined him as he picked up the phone, dialing the number he had gotten for Reginald Holmes. The line crackled before a voice answered, smooth and confident.
Reginald Holmes here.
Mr. Holmes, this is Detective Frank Mathews from the Sydney Police. I'd like to ask you a few questions about a case I'm working on.
Of course, Detective. I'm always happy to assist law enforcement.
Crete, can you come down to the station? I believe your insights could be quite valuable.
Down to the station?
Holmes replied, a knowing edge to his voice that made Mathews tighten his grip on the receiver.
Yes, it's quite urgent. I'll tell you more once you're here.
Replied Frank with a controlled tone.
All right, Detective. This sounds serious. I'll be down there shortly,
replied Holmes. After hanging up, Mathews exchanged a glance with Kalman.
He's on his way. Would you come willingly if you had killed someone?
Kalman nodded, his expression serious.
Do you think he's involved in all this?
Frank stared at the documents on his desk.
Hard to say. There was a potential motive for Holmes, the Pathfinder, and he did hire Smith in the past. But I don't understand why he'd be working with Brady. Now, why is he involved in it?
Kalman nodded again.
Yeah, this is all a bit too convenient for Brady.
He's just an innocent man trying to help. I don't buy it.
Frank measured his words.
Yeah, this isn't adding up. Did you get the signed statement from Brady?
Kalman pulled out an envelope from his jacket.
Here it is.
Good. Let's see what Holmes has to say about this.
As they prepared for the meeting, Frank's mind raced with theories and thoughts of what they had uncovered. A web of deceit and ambition that tied Holmes to Jim Smith, and the murky dealings that surrounded him. 20 minutes later, the door swung open, and in walked Reginald Holmes, a tall, handsome man, impeccably dressed and with a very concerned look on his face. He scanned the room with a fidgety gaze, his eyes landing on Frank.
Detective Mathews,
he said with a fake smile.
What can I help you with today?
Frank steeled himself.
Let's start with a simple discussion about your relationship with Jim Smith. It appears you had a bit of history together.
Holmes' expression grew more tense. Worry etched across his face.
Detective, yes. I knew Jim Smith. I read about his murder in the papers. It's, well, tragic.
Frank narrowed his eyes.
Tragic? You seem personally affected by this. Can you elaborate on your relation with Smith?
Holmes ran a hand through his hair, gathering his thoughts.
In 1928 or 1929, I had the Andera flats built at McMahon's Point. Jim was builder on that project. I supplied the funds through an overdraft from a bank.
Frank noted the details, keenly aware of the connections.
And after that?
Towards the end of 1933, I employed Smith as a caretaker of the Pathfinder. He worked there until about Easter of 1934.
Holmes continued, his tone growing more serious.
I saw him several times after the yacht sank, particularly when you made inquiries about that unfortunate event. However, I don't think I laid eyes on him since the beginning of this year.
Interesting. When exactly did you last see him? And what did you two meet about?
Holmes took a deep breath, his gaze momentarily faltering.
We met to discuss another construction site around mid-January, a potential project, but nothing ever came of it. I'm sorry to hear about his disappearance.
He paused, searching Frank's face for a hint of empathy.
But truthfully, I haven't seen or heard from Jim in months.
Frank watched him closely, noting the concern in his expression.
You're saying you lost contact with him?
Correct,
Holmes replied, his voice steadying despite the underlying worry.
It was as if he simply fell off the radar. I assumed he was busy with whatever it is he got involved in. You know how it is. Sometimes people just drift away.
Mathews nodded, processing Holmes' words.
I understand, Mr. Holmes. There's something I would like to show you,
he said, rising from his chair. Holmes raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued.
What you have in mind, Detective?
Come with us,
Frank replied, gesturing towards the door.
I have something to show you that is relevant to our conversation.
Holmes hesitated for a moment, his curiosity battling with caution.
Lead the way, Detective.
Mathews and Kalman led Holmes into a stark interrogation room, the lights casting a harsh glow over the table and uncomfortable chairs. Sitting at the table was Pat Brady, handcuffed with a defeated slouch. His eyes flickered up, widening in surprise as he recognized Holmes. Frank leaned forward, locking his gaze on Holmes.
Do you know this man, Mr. Holmes? His name is Pat Brady.
Holmes shook his head firmly, a hint of defiance in his voice.
I've never seen this man before in my life.
Brady's face flushed with frustration.
You're a liar, Holmes. We've crossed paths more than you're letting on.
Mathews shot Brady a sharp look, his tone turning stern.
Hush now, Pat. Let's keep this civil.
Brady clenched his jaw, the tension vibrating in the air as he glanced between Mathews and Holmes. Holmes smirked slightly, his confidence wavering.
It seems I've made quite an impression. But really, Detective, I assure you I'm no more acquainted with Mr. Brady than a stranger in the street.
Calman stepped in, his voice low but firm.
Well then, Mr. Holmes, I think you'll be very interested in hearing what Pat has to say about you and Jim Smith.
He pulled out a redacted copy of Brady's statement from the previous night and handed it to Holmes. As Holmes read it, a flicker of worry crossed his face.
What is this?
He demanded, his tone sharp.
You can't be serious.
Brady looked up, the spark of satisfaction in his eyes.
You know exactly what I'm talking about, Holmes. You and Smith were in cahoots.
Mathews and Calman exchanged glances, sensing the tension rising.
Can I speak to you in private?
Holmes said to Detective Mathews, his voice low but filled with urgency.
What's the matter, Reg? You got something to say behind my back?
Brady asked, crossing his hands.
I don't know this man or anything about what's written here. Please, you have to believe me.
Holmes insisted, his gaze intense as he locked eyes with Frank. Frank nodded to Calman, and they led Holmes out of the interrogation room. Holmes kept his position and signed a statement on what he had said about not seeing Jim since early in the year and about not knowing Pat Brady at all. Pat Brady also stood his ground, telling the police that Holmes was clearly lying and that proved that he was trying to cover up the truth. Based on the information collected, for the detectives there were two possible scenarios. Either Pat Brady had lured and killed Jim and was trying to point the finger at Reginald Holmes, or Reginald Holmes indeed had orchestrated Jim's murder and sent his goons to take care of the gruesome business in the cabin where Jim was spending the night. On the dawn of May 20th, the rain had finally eased after a light storm, leaving the waters near the harbor as desolate as a forsaken dream. A lone motorboat was drifting on the water just outside the busy docks. Reginald Holmes sat drunk and slumped over the helm. His glazed eyes, flickering in the pale light of early dawn, darted around in a haze of regret and despair. Each gust that rocked the boat sounded like the mocking whispers of a city that had left him behind. Holmes' trembling hand dug into the pocket of his jacket. In that liminal space between the harbor's bustle and the open sea, the crushing weight of his ruin settled in like an unforgiving tide. With a desperate resolve born of too many drinks and too few options, he withdrew a tarnished revolver, a relic that reflected his own state of mind. Fixing its cold metal barrel to his temple, he shut his eyes and squeezed. A sharp crack tore through the bay. Instead of eternal blackness, Holmes was assaulted by a gut-wrenching and violent lurch. With the shock of the gunshot, he had lost his footing and had fallen into the frigid water. The searing bite of the icy water against his skin jolted him awake, his senses reeling from shock and pain. Gasping for breath, his head throbbing with an intensity that he could barely sustain, he realized the fatal bullet had missed its final mark. With a raw, unyielding determination born of absolute defeat, Holmes clawed his way back to the battered boat. Each agonizing movement was a war against his own body as he hauled himself, shivering and bloodied, onto the slick deck. He slumped heavily against the helm, the taste of failure bitter on his tongue. His suicide had been a mockery, an abortive escape from the torment that still clung to him like a second skin. In that stark moment of grim clarity, Reginald Holmes understood that the demons he faced were far from vanquished. The relentless tick of time, echoing even in the lapping waters around him, would continue to haunt him. Detective Frank Mathews was just settling into his day when the phone rang, a jarring, insistent clatter that broke the murk of early morning. It was exactly 9 a.m., and as the pale light crept into his cramped office, the call sharpened his senses. The voice on the other end was clipped and filled with urgency.
Detective Mathews, you need to get down to the docks immediately.
The call rasped.
Reginald Holmes has been spotted in the water. The Coast Guard's been on his tail for 3 hours now. They reckon he's drunk, armed, and witnesses say he tried to kill himself.
Frank's mind raced as he grabbed his fedora and coat, the weight of decades of hard cases and darker nights settling on his shoulders. He stepped out into a Sydney morning that felt more like a bad dream than the start of a day. The city was waking slowly, its streets slick with remnants of overnight rain, but nothing could mask the gravity of the news. At the docks, the scene was as chaotic as whispered rumors in a seedy pub. The Coast Guard's chasers were slicing through the grey water like knives through cold butter, their searchlights scouring the restless waves. Officers in oilskins shouted orders into the wind, their faces taut with the strain of chasing a man whose desperation was as palpable as the salt in the air. Frank moved among them with measured determination. His eyes, sharp and unyielding beneath the brim of his hat, took in every detail. The frantic splashes, the erratic dance of a boat being chased on the water, and the unmistakable shape of a broken man adrift in his own despair. He recalled the call. Holmes had tried to end it all, to disappear beneath the crushing waves, but fate had other plans. Now, the Coast Guard believed him dangerous, a drunk, armed, and unstable shadow of a man they needed to reel in before things turned even grimmer. Frank's voice cut through the morning clamor as he addressed a young officer.
Send the Coast Guard boat a message. I want that man in custody, alive.
His tone was as hard as concrete, laced with years of battling the underbelly of Sydney's darker side. As the chase stretched on, Frank pulled himself closer to the unfolding drama. A life unraveling at sea. There was no mystery in his line of work, just the cold, dismal reality that sometimes even the desperate can't escape. Watching the Coast Guard's relentless pursuit, Frank's thoughts danced between professional duty and the all-too-familiar sorrow of another life drowning in its own demons. The Coast Guard managed at the end to wrestle Holmes from his drifting boat. Detective Frank was waiting there, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of early morning. As the paramedics swarmed to tend to Holmes, a wreck of a man bleeding profusely with a bullet-sized wound and powder burns on his forehead, Frank's eyes narrowed beneath his brimmed hat.
Holmes,
Frank said, his voice slow and steady.
You're in a world of hurt. Listen carefully. You can turn this around and help us get somewhere with this mess.
Holmes, barely conscious, and his face etched with shame and agony, gripped the edge of a cold metal bench as he tried to regain control of his ragged breath. Blood trickled down his temple, mingling with the seawater streaming down his pallid skin. His words were disjointed, heavy with confusion.
I'm willing to say what I know,
Holmes rasped, his voice trembling.
But, see, Jim Smith is dead. He's dead.
He paused as if trying to collect his muddled thoughts.
The murderer, he's out there watching us. I would have shot him if I had the guts. But now it's all gone sideways.
Detective Frank stepped closer, his tone razor-sharp over the clamor of the docks and the sea.
Who did it, Holmes? Who's the one behind all this?
Holmes' eyes darted around, lost in a haze of pain and dread.
They've been extorting me, blackmailing me.
His words tumbled out in a mix of desperation and delirium.
I'd have done what was right, give him a bullet to the head. But if I weren't so damn scared...
Holmes slumped down, holding his head. Frank's jaw clenched at the chaotic confession. He could see that Holmes was not in his right mind. Under these circumstances, anything he said wouldn't hold in court. It needed to be properly recorded and scrutinized at the station. He barked out over the noise to the medic.
Make sure he's tended to, and get him to the hospital immediately.
Gritting his teeth, Frank addressed Holmes again.
We'll talk more once your wound has been tended to. You can still make this right, Holmes. I'll help you. Just hold on. Don't lose your head any further.
As the paramedics hurried to stabilize Holmes, Detective Frank Mathews surveyed the scene. The calm after the storm was slowly returning against the gray morning. He looked once more at the grim look etched on the face of a man who had tried to escape his own demons. Frank knew that amid the twisted confessions and blurred memories lay the key to unraveling the dark undercurrents surrounding Jim Smith's disappearance. 9 days later, Reginald Holmes, having been released from the hospital and having spent a few days at home, was called to give his deposition regarding Jim Smith's death. Detective Mathews and Kalman sat opposite a battered Reginald Holmes. His eyes, vacant yet haunted, flickered between the two detectives as Frank cleared his throat, his voice low and edged with steel.
Mr. Holmes, for the record, start with who you are and what you know about Jim Smith.
I'm an engineer. I live at 3 Bayview Street, McMahon's Point.
He started.
I knew James Smith. I first met him when he was building flats for my wife. Later, he worked for me as a caretaker on the Pathfinder. I met his wife at the same time.
He paused, his eyes unfocused as memories came tumbling back.
I also know a man called Pat Brady. We met through Smith. They were friends.
Detective Kalman exchanged a glance with Frank before interjecting.
And when did you last see Smith?
Christmas 1934. Then in January, he stopped by my shipyard about a proposed subdivision project. He'd been talking with Mr. Tate, an architect, about the job. He came asking for a small loan here and there. I paid him for his taxi fare from the Pathfinder, all proper until matters weren't sour.
Frank's eyes narrowed.
Sour enough that he'd be threatening you for money?
Holmes let out a fractured sigh.
No, not exactly from Smith. But Brady, yes. He's been hounding me for money for months. Threatened to ruin me with bank trouble and jail over the Pathfinder. I gave him money, £10 one day, then small amounts on other occasions. He even phoned me for cash from Cronulla, sending me threats under false names. He said that Smith needed money because he had squealed over a forged check, landing one of his mates in jail.
And what did Smith say?
Holmes shifted under the glare.
Smith, he came by one Sunday evening asking for £50, said it was a life and death matter, told me if I didn't help, Brady and his friends would shoot him. I didn't give him a penny, not since, not after that. Then, one morning, Brady came to me, all dirty and disheveled, claiming he had a row with Smith. He said I killed the bastard, and he warned me, threatened me with what he'd do if I ever mentioned a word.
Detective Frank leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Holmes as he gripped the cold metal table between them. The interrogation room was quiet except for the low hum of the overhead light and the occasional scrape of Frank's pen on his notepad.
Now, Mr. Holmes,
Frank said.
I want this to be clear. You're saying Pat Brady mentioned to you that Smith had squealed over a check and put one of Pat's friends in jail, and then Pat confessed to killing Smith over it? Run me through that again.
Holmes' voice trembled as he began.
Yes, that's right. Prior to Brady leaving for Tasmania, he confided that they believed Smith was a police informant and that he had landed one of Brady's mates behind bars. It came up because Smith told me Brady had forged a check under my name. I confronted him and asked for the money back, and Brady did eventually end up returning it.
His gaze dropped to the scarred table as if searching for something to hold on. Frank's eyes narrowed.
And then?
About 7 in the morning on April 9th, Brady showed up at my house. He was filthy, untidy, with anger written all over his face. I offered him some brandy just to calm his nerves.
He paused, nodding as if to steady himself before continuing.
I barely remember what he said next. He kept saying that I needed to keep my mouth shut about what he had told me about Smith. He said he'd never had any trouble with him. I was confused and asked him what he was talking about. He looked at me with this wild look in his eyes. He said he had had a row with Smith and that he killed him. I nearly choked on my own disbelief. When I asked again, he didn't mince his words. He said he killed the bastard, and that if I said anything to anyone, I'd end up the same way. He told me that if he didn't do it himself, one of his cobbers would. That's when he also told me that if anyone comes asking about Smith, I don't know him and he doesn't know me.
A heavy silence fell over the room as Holmes' words hung like a noose. Detective Frank's pen scratched furiously, noting every detail. Holmes continued.
He left, only to return later that same night asking for money. He said he'd spilt too much, and warned again. Amy whispered of it, and it's over for me. When I asked about Smith's body, he smirked and said, "They won't get that. I dumped it in a trunk outside Port Hacking. I'll tell you everything. I'll know who squealed if anything comes out. And if the cops get me, you'll get yours. My friends will see to it."
Frank's jaw tightened as he absorbed every word.
So it's been constant threats then? The man was terrorizing you?
Holmes nodded miserably.
Continual threats. I was afraid for me and my family. I didn't know Brady's true colors until it was too late.
He paused to collect himself, his eyes glazing momentarily with regret.
And then?
Frank prodded, leaning closer.
On the day the papers first spilled about an arm being found in the Coogee Aquarium, Brady called again. He wanted to see me immediately. He arrived at my house around 9 in the morning. He grabbed the newspaper, pointed to a paragraph in his. "Have you read this?" When I told him that I hadn't, he said, "I believe that's one of Jim's arms, that it would put him in a jam and that I knew too much to keep my mouth shut, and that if anybody asks, I didn't know him." He said that if there was any squealing, he'd have his cobbers ready. He even told me he'd have me watched and said he wouldn't be far away from me.
Detective Frank Mathews paused, his gaze steady and hard as he exchanged a look with Cal.
So, Brady was making threats, coercing you, forcing you into silence even.
Yes, I was terrified. That's why I denied knowing him when you confronted me with him in this very room.
Frank tapped his pen once more, the sound sharp in the heavy silence.
And that, Mr. Holmes, is your final recounting?
Holmes nodded shakily, his hand trembling as he reached for the corner of the table. Detective Frank leaned back in his chair, eyeing Holmes carefully. The man was unraveling, thread by thread, but there was a steadiness creeping into his voice now, a strange, resigned clarity.
You understand what this means, Holmes?
Frank said, his voice even.
This isn't just a statement in a dusty file. If we take this to court, you'll be called to testify.
Holmes nodded, slow and deliberate. His face was pale, blood from the bullet wound in his forehead still crusted along his brow, but his eyes were fixed and certain.
"I'll testify,"
he said, almost like an oath.
"I've said it now. I've held it in too long. A man can only live with that sort of thing for so long. I'll speak in court. I'll say it all."
Frank didn't respond right away. He tapped his pen against the table once, then again.
You should consider protection. Brady's in lockup, sure, but men like him, they don't work alone. You said it yourself, his cobbers. We can assign someone to keep an eye on you. It's not just for your sake, but for your family's.
Holmes gave a tired, thin smile and shook his head.
No more police. No more running. If he's behind bars, that's enough for me. I'm not looking over my shoulder anymore. I've got the weight off my chest now. I'll lay low, but I won't disappear. I'm done being afraid.
Frank studied him. There was something final in Holmes' tone, like a man who knew he was getting a second chance in life.
All right,
he said finally, closing his notebook.
But if you so much feel as a shadow behind you, I want you to call me, you hear?
Holmes nodded again, slower this time.
I hear.
Frank stood.
Then, let's get this processed properly. We've got a lot of work ahead. But maybe now, for the first time, we've got the truth on our side.
With Holmes's confession secured, police launched an urgent search along the Port Hacking coastline. Teams worked through wind and sea spray, combing coves and rocky inlets for the tin trunk supposed to hold Jim Smith's remains. Meanwhile, a court date was set for June 12th to charge Pat Brady with Smith's murder. Though Brady sat behind bars, the missing body was key to solidifying the case. Detective Frank Mathews pushed his team. He knew the trunk could make or break the trial. As days ticked down, the pressure mounted as they could not hold Brady in jail for much longer. The search wasn't just for evidence, it was a race against time to bring justice to a man who had been butchered and dumped in the ocean. But the body was nowhere to be found. On the night of June 11th, less than 12 hours before the trial would begin, the moon was about to reach its zenith. Reginald Holmes had been up since before the birds stirred. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, drifted to the rear-view mirror of his Nash sedan as he sat parked along Hickson Road. The engine idled, the air inside stale and heavy with the reek of cigarette smoke. He had spent the afternoon pacing in Albert Stannard's sitting room, chain-smoking, mumbling, drinking. When the nerves overtook him, he left his friend to visit his lawyer one last time before the trial. After visiting his lawyer, he went to park under the newly built Sydney Bridge where his friend Albert was supposed to meet him. Holmes waited, heart pounding like a drum in his ears. At last, from down the road, a figure emerged. His friend Albert Stannard, walking slowly, hesitantly. Beside him, another man followed. Tall, heavy, face obscured by a pulled-down hat. Holmes didn't look at the stranger. He knew who he was. Or at least, what he was. Albert approached the driver's side of the car and leaned in. Holmes didn't speak at first. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched tight.
I've made peace with it.
Holmes finally said, voice low and graveled.
It has to be done.
He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, fat with banknotes. With a shaking hand, he passed it to his friend through the opened window.
Tell my wife. Tell her I'm sorry. For everything.
Albert took it with a trembling hand.
You don't have to do this, Reg.
Holmes shook his head.
I already did. I just need it finished.
The stranger, silent until now, shifted his weight. He leaned casually on the passenger's side window, his knuckles tapping the frame. Holmes didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. There was a long, tense moment. Then Holmes gave a slow nod. Albert took a few steps back. The stranger moved without urgency, like a man clocking in for work. He opened the passenger door. Holmes took a final drag from his cigarette and exhaled. 3 sharp cracks shattered the silence. Holmes jerked as the bullets tore through his side. Blood spread across his suit in dark rivers. His head slumped against the glass. The cigarette slipped from his fingers and burned out on the floor mat. The stranger stood there a moment longer, staring at the body like an artist surveying his finished work. Then he reached in, placed the small revolver in Holmes' limp hand, and stepped back. Albert turned away, sick with guilt and relief. He had done what Reg asked. He had made sure the family would be provided for. That Reginald's secrets died with him. The killer walked off into the fog. A patrol officer checked on the car an hour later as it was suspiciously idling under the newly built harbor bridge. He found Holmes slumped behind the wheel, the engine still purring faintly. Blood painted the interior. A revolver lay loosely in his hand. Detective Frank arrived shortly after that, pushing past the police cordon with grim determination. He stared at the body for a long time. The pain was sharp, not just for the loss of another life, but the gut-punch understanding of what this meant. The only man willing to tell the full truth about Jim Smith's disappearance was now dead. The path to justice began with momentum and ended in a tangle of mistrials, acquittals, and dead ends. On June 12, 1935, the coroner's inquest into the death of Jim Smith commenced. The severed arm in the Tiger Shark tank was the only tangible piece of evidence. But it didn't last. Just 5 days later, the inquest was adjourned amid legal challenges. No body, only an arm. It was insufficient. On June 24th, the Supreme Court quashed it entirely. Authorities tried again. A magistrate's hearing opened on July 3rd, culminating in Pat Brady being committed for trial for Smith's murder. But when the trial opened in the Supreme Court on September 9th, it unraveled quickly. Only a day after it began, the judge directed the jury to acquit Brady due to insufficient evidence. A day later, Brady was apprehended again, but only on unrelated check forgery charges. Any hope of tying a noose around Smith's killer now rested on a corpse that would never be found, and a witness who never got a chance to speak. Holmes' death wasn't a simple matter either. In the weeks that followed, rumors swirled. Witnesses said Holmes had been with Albert Stannard the day of his murder. Stannard, a known associate, later turned up at the crime scene accompanied by a man known as Jack Strong, a violent figure believed to have underworld ties. Reginald Holmes' death had the hallmarks of an execution. But what was he doing there that night? As if he knew what would happen. The theory that emerged was chilling: an assisted suicide, orchestrated to look like a hit. Holmes, racked with fear, guilt, and blackmail, had agreed to his own death, a final act of sacrifice to protect his family, secure a life insurance payout, and shield his partners from further scrutiny. If he died before testifying, no formal charges could pin down the criminal web around Smith's death, and that's exactly what happened. Detectives Frank Mathews and Danny Kalman arrested Stannard and Strong, who were charged with Holmes' murder on October 10th. Their first trial began, but the jury couldn't reach a verdict. A retrial followed on December 9th, but both men were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Detective Frank Mathews would go on to become the head of the Sydney Criminal Investigation Branch, and gave one final statement regarding the case to the press before resigning.
There are cases that break the law, and there are cases that break men. This one did both.
And so, the case that had gripped a nation ended without justice. No one was ever convicted for the murders of Jim Smith and Reginald Holmes. The severed arm in the shark tank became legend. The truth, like the rest of Smith's body, was never recovered. Pat Brady was in and out of prison several times after this affair, but lived out his life mostly a free man. And in the echoes of Sydney's dark criminal history, the truth remained buried, along with the men it consumed. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now again, this is an unsolved case, and this recounting is only my interpretation of what might have happened. Did you know about this case? What's your take on it? Hit me up on social media. Any feedback on the case or the episodes is highly appreciated. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe so you can listen to all the new content. Until next time, and as always, thanks for listening.